Okay, now moving to the second last extra guideline that we have here. Our next rule is going to involve indirect quotations, because indirect quotations sometimes they have to be adjusted in adherence to polite or honorific expression. So this is kind of similar to the first rule, because in the first rule we had to change polite form sentences into the plain form if we wanted to use them as quotes in an indirect quotation. This guideline is similar because if we're using the quotation in our current speech, and in our current speech we need to have honorific or polite expression, then we're going to have to tailor that quotation that we're using to show that. So that might be a little confusing to comprehend, so let's just go into an example sentence that demonstrates this. So for the first line in our pair of example sentences, we have 彼女は両親が迎えに来ますと言いました. And what this line will translate to is, she said my parents are coming to pick me up. Let's break down the sentence bit by bit. First up we have 彼女, which is going to mean she or her. We have wa marking she or her as the topic of the sentence, and then now we have our direct quotation. So we have the kagikakko to indicate that we're starting a direct quotation here, and our direct quotation is 両親が迎えに来ます. And so 両親 is going to be parents, and we know it's going to be referring to the speaker's parents because it's 両親, which is the more casual form, as opposed to ご両親, which is what you use to refer to other people's parents. We have the ga marking them as the subject, and then we have 迎えに来ます. And 迎えに来る is going to be a term that basically means to come to pick up, and so we have 迎えに来ます, and 来ます is of course the polite mas form of 来る, and that's going to be the direct quotation in the sentence there. 両親が迎えに来ます. My parents are coming to pick me up. And then we end that main sentence that has the quotation with と言いました. So altogether it's, she said my parents are coming to pick me up. And so again, that's going to be a sentence using a direct quotation. So now what we need to do is evaluate the indirect quotation version of the sentence. And so our line is 彼女はご両親が迎えにいらっしゃると言いました. And so what this line is going to translate to in English is, she said that her parents are coming to pick her up. But we need to evaluate the Japanese as well, because this is where there are things that can't be seen when we're just looking at the English translation that are very important to the Japanese language. And so the first thing that we should be noticing here is that thing that I just mentioned earlier, and that is that we're using go ryoshin this time instead of ryoshin, because the speaker of the current sentence is quoting the original speaker who said my parents, and since we're now referring to someone else's parents, we have to add that beautifier go on top of ryoshin to be appropriately polite to someone else's parents. Then the second thing that we need to note here is that we're using mukae ni irasharu instead of mukae ni kimasu. And the reason behind that is because we're displaying honorific expression here, and we haven't really covered honorifics in this video series quite yet, but basically all we need to know about it right now relative to this example is that when you're speaking to people that you consider superior to you, or that should be considered superior to you, you're not only going to use polite speech, but you're going to use honorific speech. And what this means basically is that when you're describing the actions that they do, they get this tier of words for themselves. So for example, if you're talking about your teacher, and in this case you should be using honorific expression for your teacher because you should be showing your teacher respect, instead of saying my teacher went to her office, there would be a completely separate word to describe the action of going, or went in this case. And that's basically what's happening in our example sentence right now. Instead of using the word kuru, which means to come, this person's parents who you're talking about get a whole different word, which is in this case irasharu. And so the conclusive thing to note here is that if we were using a direct quotation mark, then we're just saying what the girl said about her parents coming to pick her up verbatim, so we don't need to change anything. She said mukae ni ikimasu, so we're going to say that too if we're directly quoting her. But if we're using indirect quotation and we're paraphrasing what she said, it's no longer her talking about her own parents, it's the speaker, you or me, talking about her parents, and thus we need to show some respect, and so we have to alter the quotation in some way, and in this case it's using honorific speech. And one last thing to point out here is that this is another example of turning a quotation into its plain form to use it as an indirect quotation. So instead of mukae ni irashaimasu, we're using mukae ni irasharu, which is kind of ironic because we're changing polite form to plain form after all that talk about honorific speech and being polite to the person. But the rule of plain form in indirect quotation is going to supersede that notion, so yeah. And so to rehash this example sentence, our direct quotation is going to be ryoshin ga mukae ni kimasu, which is she said my parents are coming to pick me up. Then our indirect quotation version is going to be 彼女はご両親が迎えにいらっしゃると言いました, which is she said that her parents are coming to pick her up, which doesn't show any irregularities in the English translation, but in the Japanese, what's going down here is, of course, that we need to change it into its polite form, into its plain form, we need to add the go to ryoshin because we need to show respect to other people's parents. And in this case, we're using honorific expression to describe the actions of someone else's parents. Now for our last extra guideline, this is going to be something that is pretty relatable to the English language as well, because in the English language, if we're directly quoting someone that said, I want to go to the market, if it's a direct quotation, then we can say, he said, I want to go to the market. And that's going to be kind of confusing because you don't know if the I in that sentence is referring to the person you're quoting or you. It's equally confusing in the indirect quotation version, which is, he said that I want to go to the market. And so yeah, the I in that sentence is still pretty vaguely referring to either the person you're quoting or you yourself. In the Japanese language, there are some more stricter guidelines that try to avoid this confusion entirely. So in the Japanese language, if we're using this as a direct quotation, then we're going to leave that I in the sentence. And in Japanese, this will be the first person pronoun equivalent of I, which will be watashi or ore or something along those lines. So we can leave that in the sentence in the quotation if we're using a direct quotation. And with that, it'll still be just as confusing as the English language, because if you're saying it verbally, you don't see the quotation marks being used, so you don't know if that I is referring to the person who originally said the quote or the person who's quoting the person right now. So that confusion still kind of remains if we're talking verbally. However, the Japanese language does kind of have an advantage to the English language in the indirect quotation category, because we're not going to include the I in the sentence at all for indirect quotation marks. And if needed be, to avoid confusion entirely, we can replace it with the word jibun, which means oneself. And if we use jibun to mean oneself, that's basically going to refer to the speaker of the original quote, not the person who's saying the sentence right now. So of course, now let's just jump into a pair of example sentences that demonstrates this differentiation. So for the direct quotation version of the example sentence, we have kare wa downtown ni ikimashita to imashita. And what this will translate to is, he said, I went downtown. Break down the sentence bit by bit. Kare wa, kare is he, wa is marking him as the subject of the sentence. Then we have our direct quotation here because we have the kagikakko. And the direct quotation is watashi wa downtown ni ikimashita. Watashi is going to be I, wa is marking I as the subject. We have downtown is going to be downtown. We have ni marking it as the destination. And then we have ikimashita to mean to go, or in the past polite tense, that's going to be went. And so that's the end of the direct quotation. So we mark it with the particle to. And then we have imashita to mean said. So he said, I went downtown. Again, when we say that sentence, it's vague as to what the I is referring to, the person who said the quote originally or the person who is quoting him. But in written form, we can obviously tell that it means the person who originally said the line because of the quotation marks. Now for the indirect quotation version, we have much more clarity in both verbal form and written form. And so for our line, we have kare wa jibun wa downtown ni ikimashita to imashita. Everything in the sentence is the same as the other version, except watashi is replaced by jibun, which means oneself as opposed to I. And so what this will translate to in the English language is, he said that he went downtown. Although it's not quite a literal translation, because jibun means oneself, and in that case it would be, he said that oneself went downtown. That doesn't make sense. We have to naturalize it, and so we turn oneself to he. So he said he went downtown. And so that's going to be the interpretation of the word jibun here that we need to memorize basically. If jibun is going to be there, then it's going to be referring to the original speaker. And so for the sake of clarity, more clarity than the English language, admittedly, that is going to be a small price to pay. Not really a price at all, really. Just remember what jibun means. Yeah. And with that, this basically concludes our basic coverage of quotations in the Japanese language, how to use them, the difference between direct quotations and indirect quotations, and how it kind of slightly differs from the English language usage of quotation.